Our two major supermarket chains, Coles and Woolworths, rank amongst the largest and the most successful of our Aussie homegrown companies. As consumers, we have voted in droves with our feet and our wallets in support of these two big businesses and at the expense of many smaller specialist retailers on the high street. Now, what is it that inflames us so much about supermarkets? What are the concerns that warrant or appear to warrant sustained scrutiny? Are the concerns we had a decade ago, are they the same as the ones we have now, or have they changed? And what have been the responses by governments, by the industry, individual businesses, and us as citizen consumers? How effective have those responses been? Do the responses need to change? Consumers are actually benefiting. Concentration notwithstanding, there is fierce competition between the two giants.
I think there's two major trends that stand out over the last 10 years. Firstly, the rise of Aldi, its phenomenal growth, as well as the recovery of Coles. Coles did a great job of turning around its supermarket, which had been underperforming quite significantly.
The owner of that business is quoted as saying, "Conditions in supermarket retailing are more competitive than at any other stage in the past 40 years."
Supermarket retailing is up for a different era. We're probably going to see some growth in online, wide-ranging views about how fast that will grow, but certainly we're going to spend more of our groceries online. I think issues around how much we spend in a supermarket versus outside of a supermarket, particularly around our meal occasions, is another area to consider, as well as the major chains. They're both now very mature, very concentrated, find very few areas for further consolidation, so may struggle to grow their market share as a combined group.
One of the products of the fierce competition between the retailers was that in striving for price advantages, they were rationalising their supply base, they were squeezing their suppliers for margins, and they were promoting private labels. The power imbalance in this context was seen as manifested in three ways: a lack of transparency and certainty in supply agreements, a general lack of good faith in supply dealings and negotiations, and a lack of access to justice, particularly for smaller suppliers, in dispute resolution.
In the farmer's view, there is absolutely no doubt that dollar milk has had an impact on farmer returns. Rebalancing supermarket power will be very difficult because of the race to the lowest price.
So back in 2008, we made a number of findings, but most relevantly we concluded that grocery retailing was workably competitive. But in the course of 2011, these supply issues really burst forth in the national press, and from politicians. Supplier groups were obviously engaging significantly with politicians, and the major supermarkets were being accused of bullying and other forms of conduct in relation to their dealings with suppliers.
So after the loss of the case against Woolworths, what is the attitude of the ACCC about further investigations? Is it likely to intervene, or was it chilled by the decision of the court?
Oh, look, we don't get chilled very easily, I think it's fair to say. In fact, it probably will spur us on because that we don't want our last supermarket case to be a loss.
The Horticultural Code of Conduct I put here was born a sickly child. These are markets that weren't failing. I mean, they were unfair, but they didn't fail. But the growers felt that they were dealt with unfairly. The markets may be unfair, but they're efficient, and lots of the worst abuses have been managed by a combination of like non-legislative response. But I think the Horticultural Code of Conduct simply cannot compensate for the structural issues facing growers.
At about the same time as the Coles case was unfolding through 2014, the major supermarkets and the AFGC, the Food and Grocery Council, were trying to deal with these unfair practices through a Food and Grocery Code of Conduct. And that code has now been introduced and really, I think, sets a new framework for dealing between the supermarkets and their suppliers.
The code doesn't regulate price, and nor should it. But ultimately, for suppliers, if you talk to them, what keeps them up at night is price. And they've been told by their retailers and their buyers, no price increases. We need to acknowledge that what the code proposes is actually quite a significant cultural change, if not transformation, in this industry on the part of both retailers and suppliers. And amongst suppliers, we got the strong sense that there is a deeply ingrained cynicism about whether in fact the chains will actually change their ways, and an ongoing reluctance just to push back too strongly, to put their head above the parapet, for fear of jeopardising important critical relationships.
The level of concern about retribution I found quite extraordinary.
The buying teams within the retailers are clearly becoming more savvy, clearly becoming more code aware and aware of their actions. I think one of the probably unintended pieces is less in writing. So suppliers will continue to get phone calls, and the phone call will be fairly broad, with the unspoken often being the intent of the conversation.
Certainly a year ago, there was a significant difference between what the senior management team felt was understood at a junior level and the actual behaviours at a junior level. So where the directors were clear that they were fully compliant, at a buyer level they clearly were not. Most of us have monthly or quarterly or annual KPIs, they have almost daily KPIs. If the sales are soft for 2 or 3 days, day 4, all the pressure's on. When you potentially live in fear of the consequences of failure, that almost inevitably provides the fuel for poor code behaviour.
I think there is good reason to say that this code will continue to be necessary and important as a backstop regulatory measure.
So to what extent can we really hope that without a code or without adjudicators, so without the big guns, there would be compliance and a lasting change in business culture?
I think without the code, it would have been situation normal as of 5-6 years ago.
Compare that situation with the UK. Now, as I said right at the beginning, the UK has had a compulsory or mandatory code that almost mirrors ours in its provisions since 2010. But they've gone a very different way in their enforcement architecture. They've appointed a dedicated ombudsman in the Grocery Code adjudicator, Christine Taken.
When she was anointed with her fining powers, that profoundly changed the engagement from the retailers around code in the UK. So that was a very powerful piece. The other piece that, again, only an adjudicator type role can play is that very proactive, collaborative. This is not about trying to... I love the fact that she says it's not about the number of fines or investigations. It's almost the converse. If I can prevent the issues at birth, that's a good thing. Unfortunately, our adjudicator at the ACCC can only really get involved when it's become an issue and pursue it or prosecute it through the courts. It's kind of too late at that point.
The maximum level of fine I asked for and now have was 1% of UK turnover, which in Tesco's instance could have been up to £500 million.
But let there be no mistake, the markets in Europe are also quite concentrated in terms of retail. Of course, there are differences between countries. There has been no EU Commission action with the competition law tools on the issue of unfair trading practices. So unlike the ACCC, which showed willingness and capability to engage with these issues, the European Commission has been a lot more cautious. And there is a voluntary supply chain initiative with a code of conduct. However, there's not really a matching enforcement mechanism. The competition authorities' reluctance to act on these issues or to act at the EU level perhaps has been counterproductive for competition law itself. What we see is a number of recommendations to allow for even more exemptions for farmers under the common agricultural policy. So farmers are pressing hard to get exemptions from the cartel prohibition under competition law. They would like to make more use of the crisis cartel option. They would like to be able to bargain collectively, etc. Which, again, from a competition law perspective, you might wonder, what about the impact on consumer welfare? And are we doing this the best way? Are we protecting farmer incomes in the most rational way?
Markets fail in a quite technical sense when they do not bring supply and demand into equilibrium, not when they are unfair. Unfair trading, however, is a matter of economic concern when it leads to further concentration in the supply chain and impairments to dynamic efficiency.
Is that the focus of governments have been, in the last few decades, on the economic benefits, and they have withdrawn from a focus on social benefits.
We're not just consumers, we're not just shoppers, are we? Certainly hope we're not.
I think the consumer can be rightly understood as an individual, a self-reliant market actor. And I think the citizen is a politically engaged individual. They have these concerns, and at the same time, 85% of Australia's 14 million shoppers shop once a week in a supermarket.
Customers have more choice now than ever before, and they're exercising that choice.
And shareholders increasingly have concerns about the longer term implications of this mismanagement of environmental and social risks by a company. But at the heart of the changing expectations of the role of the corporation is a view that generating profit must not come at cost to the common good.
This has actually been a fantastic opportunity for the supermarkets, because in the absence of strong government standards and consumer distrust of producer-led standards, I think, the supermarkets have been able to position themselves, to quote Jane Dixon, as legitimate food authorities. It's good that supermarkets are responsive to stakeholder concerns and make some effort, but I suggest we can't rely on the supermarkets alone to govern these real issues. The vigorous debate and critique of how supermarkets govern themselves is essential to our democracy, as essential as debate and critique of how our federal government does.
We do not plan for municipal markets anymore. Can you believe that? Moreover, independent retailers and municipal markets contribute to the public realm in a way which is beyond the reach of supermarkets, no matter how good the architecture is. This is because independent retailers and municipal markets are of the public domain. They rely on the infrastructure and assets which are owned and operated by the community institutions. They belong to the people and they reflect that. Independent retailers and municipal markets also perform a vital business incubation function that cannot be replicated within corporatised big box retailing.
Yeah, I think the international competition or any new entrants from here will still find it difficult unless there's major changes in the planning laws.
Let's keep our roles nice and clean and separate. Let the private sector make its money, let government regulate it. I think we should regulate harder and faster.
I'd go harder, faster, smarter.
Deal.